Okay, perfect. So I've been there about 8 years now at Express Employment Professionals, and then during that time we've also launched Specialized Recruiting Group and Frontline Training Solutions. Our goal really is to be a one-stop shop for employers to help them hire, help them retain, and help them develop their teams. That's really our passion. So every year we serve several hundreds, if not 1,000 employers here locally and across the country, and then we help 3,000-4,000 people find a new career here in West Michigan every year. So we're really in the middle of that workforce and that workplace. So that's why we're often talking about things like this, because we're always trying to keep a pulse on what's really happening in the market, how do we get here, where are we headed. We're often having those conversations with our clients, so we're always really trying to just be aware of what's happening. And one thing we like to do is hopefully help sift through some of the noise that's out there. There's a lot of noise in the media, a lot of noise in the headlines. What maybe gets the most clicks isn't always what's the truth. So our goal is to help sift through some of that noise a little bit. So today, hopefully, what I deliver will help you sift through that noise a little bit and really just get a good pulse on really where we're headed and where we've been so far with these labor market dynamics. So we're going to hit on 4 things. I was told I only have 30 minutes, so we're going to go quick. We got a lot of stuff to cover. I was recently presenting to a group of Southern businesses, and I was called a fast-talking Yankee. So I'm going to be moving kind of quick. We've got a lot of slides. It's economic data, so there's going to be some stats and some charts. Actually, a lot of that stuff. Don't get too hung up on any one chart. It's more about the overall story that I'm going to tell and some of the implication that means for you as employers. So we are going to be moving fairly quickly. I do think there is going to be recording available. The slides will be available, so if you do want to go back and look at any of this in more depth, that's certainly an option. So today we're going to first talk about the current talent crisis we're in. I'm sure you guys have been feeling that the last several years. So what are some of the factors that are causing that? We're going to look at some short-term economic predictions. It's normally everyone's favorite part. Where's the economy going? What's going to happen? So we're going to talk about that. And then we're going to talk about some of the long-term demographic trends that are driving that and that really are going to drive our future, especially on that workforce labor market side. And then real quickly, just touch on how employers need to respond. So hopefully I'll just be able to leave you guys with a couple nuggets on how employers can take what you've heard today and go and be more sustainable for the future. So diving right in, let's look at the current talent crisis. So really, it's a perfect storm, decades in the making, the current crisis we're in. If you leave with one takeaway today, it's that there is not one factor that has caused this labor shortage. So it's not just the fact that people had extra unemployment money or there were stimulus checks or this factor, that factor. Take away that it's a lot of factors that have all kind of collided over the last couple years to get us to where we are today. It's definitely not one thing, so it's a lot of things. So a couple of the big things, some of these I'll dive into as we go along here. Record low unemployment rates, really at historic lows, a dropping labor force participation rate. There's really been a mismatch in the talent that's available and the jobs that are out there. Massive numbers of retirements over the last several years. Missing immigration numbers. One that's really tragic is really an addiction issue. So opioid epidemic is actually really impacting the workforce, driving some of those dropping labor force participation rates. Record-breaking quit rates. If you're an employer here, I'm sure you've probably been dealing with higher turnover than you have in the past. So that's a big factor. And then we've really had an inflated demand curve coming out of COVID, which has created that surge in job openings. So we're going to dive into a couple of these factors as we charge ahead here. So first off, record low unemployment rates. So as of February, the national unemployment rate, despite what you guys might see in headlines about layoffs, Facebook laid off 10,000 people, Google laid off people, our overall unemployment rate for the country was 3.6% in February. And January was actually 3.4%, which was the lowest unemployment rate we've had since 1969. So very low unemployment. We're back to where we were pre-COVID. You can see we were on that downward trend. We really were in that talent crisis mode. It didn't feel quite as severe in 2019 and early 2020. But really when COVID hit, obviously we had the spike, but it has come down fairly quickly. Now it could have probably come down a little quicker if there hadn't been some of the extra government unemployment programs, but we are back down to really below what economists would consider full unemployment. So very low unemployment. Other factor here, the labor force participation rate. So I was actually speaking about this with someone right beforehand. I was like, I'm going to talk about that today. So the labor force participation rate, for those of you who aren't familiar, really is looking at the percentage of the population that's actually engaging in the workforce. So they either have a job or they want to have a job. So they're unemployed and looking. And theoretically, we want this to be as high as possible because we want our population engaging in the workforce and adding value not being supported by other people who are in the workforce. So this has actually been on the decline since the year 2000. So as the baby boomers started to exit and millennials started to enter and dominate the workforce, we've seen that labor force participation rate declining. Really, since 2017, 18, 19, we've been talking about this already. We've been putting out white papers and different things to really talk about how the labor force participation rate is dropping, and that's very concerning. But what we saw when COVID hit is obviously it fell off the cliff with a lot of people leaving the workforce. We've seen that come back some, but it still hasn't gotten back to those pre-2020 levels, which were already been dropping for 2 decades. So this labor force participation rate, if there's one issue that's probably the most concerning, it's probably labor force participation rate, because this coupled with low unemployment rate, there's less people actually wanting a job, and then everyone who wants a job pretty much already has a job right now. So these 2 factors really feeding in to that talent crisis. So with those 2 things together, what do we get? We really get a historic labor gap. So this chart's looking at the number of job openings in the economy versus number of people on unemployment. Anywhere you see green, that means we got more job openings than we do unemployed people. Anywhere you see red, that means there's more job openings. Sorry, I said that the wrong way. So right now in the red, that means more job openings than unemployed people. So we're at a deficit right now. So you can see by historic standards, there normally are more people unemployed than there are available job openings. You don't want that to be too high. You don't want that up at that 12.5 million range like in the Great Recession there. But that's kind of a healthy spot to be those maybe near zero or maybe slightly more supply of talent than demand. But you can see pre-COVID even we were moving into a zone here where we had a labor shortage. So there were more job openings out there than there were people who were unemployed. And then you can see the last couple of years, we've really blown that out of the water, really a deficit of almost 5 million people. So for the last couple of years, we've been sitting at about 2 job openings for every 1 person on unemployment. And those might not even match up, so there might even be more of a deficit there. But that's where we've been sitting at. That has come down slightly here this year. So this year we've been sitting at about 6 million people on unemployment and about 10 million job openings. So we're down to only a deficit of 4 million. So it's softening a little bit, but still definitely a very large deficit there. All right, so kind of separate from just the talent crisis in terms of supply and demand, but this other factor that if you're in HR or if you're in leadership at business, that companies have been struggling with over the last 2 years is this record-breaking quit rates. So who's heard of, the Great Resignation or quiet quitting or some of those buzzwords that have been going on? So those started out as buzzwords, and then now in the data, we're really seeing that come to fruition. The quit rate here is measured by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and that's looking at a monthly basis, the percent of the workforce that's voluntarily leaving their job. So these aren't people that are, this isn't layoffs, this isn't terminations. These are people who voluntarily leave their job, probably to find another job, maybe retire or something like that. But that's been at 2.5 to really hovering around 3% for the last year. So that's saying that 3% of your workforce is voluntarily leaving every month. If you look at that on an annualized basis, that's 30 to 40% turnover a year at a company. And this is a measurement across all industries, all sorts of occupations. Obviously, some are going to be much higher, some will be much lower. But it's a very concerning trend as you're not only struggling to attract talent to fill your open positions because of the tight labor market, you're also trying to replace this turnover and churn that's potentially happening at your company. So there is some speculation. This might just be from some pent-up turnover. You can see we took a big dip during COVID because when there's uncertainty, people don't want to leave their job. So potentially this is some pent-up turnover and that will maybe come back down. But it also might just be the new reality as we are in a long-term job seeker market. People have more options. And if you're not really being intentional about being that employer of choice, there's a potential for much higher turnover than we've seen in the past. All right, so more good news here as we charge ahead. So looking at just that mismatch like I was talking about, this right here is just looking at that mismatch. And in the past when we talked about the mismatch of talent and jobs, we were talking a lot about like skilled trades or saying like we don't have enough engineers or we don't have enough people in the tech industry or IT. And yes, those roles, that's still true, there's a shortage there. But really what we've seen over the last couple of years is this big mismatch between fairly entry-level jobs. So jobs that don't require college education. They're fairly entry-level. They're the retail, the food service, the warehouse, entry-level manufacturing, production. that's where we've seen the biggest gap. You can see from when last time we pulled this data, there were 6.8 million jobs in that kind of bucket, and we had 1.8 million people unemployed who don't have a college degree. So that's where the gap has been widening the most. It's why you see every restaurant's hiring. It's why you see all these retail places are hiring. A lot of manufacturers are hiring. That gap has really widened, and we'll touch on that, a couple factors leading to that. But that's where we've seen the biggest mismatch and where we see that probably continuing to the future. One factor leading into that that I will touch on is immigration. So this is talking about legal immigration. So legal immigration, when COVID hit, the U.S. did what most countries did, and they kind of slowed down that immigration process, kind of shut it down, kind of from safety reasons or precautions, as we weren't letting people in the borders for whatever reason. So we're kind of back on track with legal immigration, back to where it was. But just because of that slowdown induced by COVID, we're missing about 2 million people who could have legally entered the country and would have probably been working. So people who legally immigrate tend to participate in the workforce at a very high level and tend to fill those more entry-level or lower skilled positions at a very high ratio. So this is one gap where we're missing a sizable chunk of the workforce that was through COVID. All right, so charging ahead here, just to summarize where we are with current talent crisis. Often I talk about that for a whole hour, so there's a lot more we could dive into, but hopefully we just highlighted a couple of things. We've got that record low unemployment, labor force participation rate has been dropping, other factors in the mix there too, like turnover and other factors there, really creating a very tight labor market. So let's talk now about where we're going. This is sometimes people's favorite part. They want to kind of look into the future here and see what's going to happen for businesses. So what are we projecting in terms of the economic activity? Maybe a potential slowdown, but maybe nothing as drastic as you might see in the headlines. So some of the data I'm going to pull here is actually from a University of Michigan study, an economist of theirs they're kind of always putting out these projections almost every month. So let's start with inflation. So this is something hot in everyone's mind and actually is kind of fueling where we're headed. So inflation, obviously, it's been very high. Inflation last year, we're expecting that to come in around 8%. As we move into this year, this particular projection is looking at inflation starting to come down, still probably averaging for the year maybe in that 5% range, but starting to come down from where we were last year, and then maybe getting back close to more normal levels as we move into 2024. So why are we talking about inflation? Well, inflation is important because when we have inflation, as you have seen, the Fed starts increasing those interest rates. So this is just looking at those interest rates. We've obviously seen those increasing. It's projected those will continue to increase probably at least through the first half of this year. Really how long those increase will be determined by what happens with inflation. So the Fed really has been increasing this at unprecedented levels to fight this unprecedented spike in inflation. And typically when they're increasing those rates, they're trying to slow down the economy. That's the goal, really, is to slow down the economy to fight inflation. So they tend to increase those rates until something kind of breaks a little bit and the inflation gets a little bit more under control. So that's kind of what we're expecting. So we expect those rates to continue to increase probably for the first half of this year before starting to come back down some. But you can see even in 2024, probably being at higher levels than we're used to over the last 10 years and maybe gradually coming down from there. So what does that mean in terms of the economy overall? So this chart here is looking at GDP growth. You can see in the yellow there is looking at annual GDP growth. You can see for last year, that number is coming in right around 2% annual GDP growth. As you look ahead, you can see 2023, 2024, positive GDP growth, but slower. So you can see about a 0.5% GDP growth for 2023, maybe close to 1% for 2024. So slower than that historic average of the 2 to 3% range. But if you look at the blue line there, that's looking at quarterly GDP growth. And one thing you'll notice is that blue line does dip below zero there later this year. So technically, a recession is any time you have 2 consecutive quarters of negative GDP growth, which is what this particular projection is projecting in late 2023. Now, this was from at the end of last year, so from a couple months ago. To be honest, as more data has come out, most of it looks more positive than negative. So increasingly, there's kind of this pessimism in the market, but most economists, as they look at the actual data, are saying, well, actually, it doesn't look that bad, really. So I would say even if this shifts, it probably will shift a little bit more on the positive side than on the negative side. So yes, probably some slowdown in growth coming, probably some some softening in that demand, but probably nothing, no sort of drastic recession. And this is looking across the whole economy. Obviously, each industry is going to be impacted differently. We're definitely seeing the tech industry struggling a little bit. So definitely each industry will be impacted differently, but at a macro level, nothing too drastic there, which hopefully is good news for everyone in this time of uncertainty. So since we're in Michigan here, I thought I'd throw up a slide on automotive industry. So this is looking at light vehicle sales. So obviously the automotive industry is super important for us across the state and in West Michigan. This projection of automotive is somewhat different than what we might normally expect as we're talking about a softening in the market or potential recession. What this is showing here is in yellow there, just total light vehicle sales. In blue is the Detroit Big Three there. And you can see we're actually projecting an uptick in vehicle sales over the next couple of years, even though that economy is predicting maybe a slight downward tick. And the main theory behind this, again, this is a projection, is that there's been such pent-up demand. You can see that drop in light vehicle sales over the last couple of years, and that hasn't been because of a lack of demand. That's been because of a lack of supply. So a lot of supply chain issues and some labor issues have really been plaguing the automotive industry. That's why prices have really skyrocketed. So there's a theory that there's a lot of pent-up demand there, and even if the economy softens a little bit, automotive demand, as these supply chains have been easing, will perform fairly strong. So actually, most economists are predicting Michigan will probably outperform the nation over the next couple years, which typically is not the case. Typically, automotive industry is very cyclical, and that drives a lot of our economy. So typically, we underperform, but we are predicted to outperform right now. And West Michigan specifically usually outperforms the state and the country. So West Michigan has a very strong outlook. Our unemployment, I should have mentioned this earlier, our unemployment rate is actually at 3.1% right now. So very, very low here in the West Michigan area. All right, so but what does this mean in terms of the labor side? So kind of equating this back to that labor demand. This is just one way that we look at labor demand. This is actually looking at demand via job postings on Indeed. You can see that baseline there was pre-COVID 2020. And you can see really an unprecedented surge in demand, really peaking at the end of 2021. But what I want to highlight is we are seeing that taper off some. So we're seeing throughout last year, you can see Grand Rapids is in green, the whole country there is in yellow. We are seeing that demand for hiring and talent has been coming down. So if you're doing your own hiring, you might have seen that maybe get a little easier recently. But by historic levels, it's still up 50% from where we were 2019, 2020. So still very strong labor demand. We don't expect that to change. So in some of our clients, we've been talking to them and they're like, yeah, this recession's coming, so it's gonna be no problem to hire people. And we're like, ooh, I wouldn't count on it yet. So, but we are expecting that to ease maybe slightly here in the short term. All right, so then just looking real quick at Michigan. So what does that mean for the Michigan unemployment rate? So again, going back to what I was mentioning, the forecast has that Michigan unemployment rate maybe upticking slightly. You can see right now Michigan's at about a 4% unemployment rate. It's projected that might uptick slightly, probably not as much as the rest of the country, but still maybe peaking at 4.5%, which most economists would still consider that near or at full employment. So maybe a slight uptick there. As I mentioned, West Michigan is so much tighter that we might not even see an uptick here, or if we do, maybe West Michigan goes to 3.5% or 3.8%. So still probably a very tight labor market. All right, so recapping, talent crisis, very tight labor market, definitely some uncertainty in the market, but it's not doom and gloom. Let's take a look now at some of those longer term trends. So we've looked at maybe what's happening over the next couple of years, but what are the longer term demographic trends that are driving some of the insights I just shared and will drive it into the future? So first off, this might be hard for you guys to see in the back, but this is looking at the younger populations. So we mentioned there's a big gap in those entry-level jobs, those more lower skilled general labor positions. A lot of that is because our younger population is really drying up. If you look at this on the left here, that's showing that population of 55 plus demographic. You can see that's just been increasing for the last decade. This is looking from 2011 to 2021. Then if you look at that prime age workforce, that 25 to 54, that kind of increased the first half of the decade and then really has leveled off over the last 5 years. But what's most concerning is if you look at that 16 to 24-year-olds, those people entering the workforce, that's really just been declining over the last 10 years and is expected to continue to decline. So that's one reason we're really starting to catch up and feel that gap in those more entry-level positions. Mostly, a lot of that's because of some long-term demographic shifts that we've seen. And this didn't happen overnight. This didn't happen during COVID. This has really been happening for the last several decades, but it kind of caught up to us right at the same time as some of those other factors were really starting to layer on top. So this is just looking at the US population growth. This is total population growth, so both natural through births and immigration. You can see 2010 to 2020, we actually had the lowest population growth on record. It really only compares to kind of a hangover that they call it that we saw after the Great Depression when people really stopped having babies. So that population growth has really been declining. One thing that is interesting is we can kind of get a glimpse ahead and look into the future on who's going to be entering the workforce. So this chart here is just showing the population by age across our country right now. So we know how many 20-year-olds there are. We know how many 15-year-olds there are. We know how many 1-year-olds there are. And what you can see from this is every year younger, there's slightly less. So there's about 1 million less 1-year-olds than there are 20-year-olds. So what does that mean? That means every year there's going to be less entering high school, less graduating from high school, less graduating from college, because these birth rates have been declining. So as we look ahead, despite some of these blips in the economy, that long-term projection is an increasingly tight and steadily tight labor market. All right, so one thing I'd like to touch on is what does that mean for college enrollment? College, higher education really has been seeing this for the last several years, is that first-time enrollment and total enrollment have been declining. So really higher education has really been starting to having to rethink their strategy in the market because there's that traditional pipeline of high school to college. There just aren't as many people there, and there's a lot of universities competing for them. So most higher education is starting to rethink how can we really dive into adult education. How can we partner with employers to help them train and develop? The employers are facing a talent crisis. How can that university help by helping them create the talent they need? So definitely a lot of work going on there in the higher education sector. Okay, so just a couple final things looking ahead, just looking at that total population. As those birth rates drop and as our population continues to age, we continue to expect that percentage of the population that's in that working age will continue to decline there. By the year 2100, we expect probably only about 60% or less of the total population will actually be in that working age as we continue to have less kids and continue to get a higher age demographics. But this isn't really something that's unique to the US. It's not really a United States problem. It really is a fairly common trend across developed countries. You can see this is actually looking at birth rates or fertility rates by country for the last several decades. And you can see whenever you drop below that 2.1% fertility rate, that's really the replacement rate. So that means that on average, each woman is having 2.1 children. So anytime you're below that, you're not having enough births to maintain your population. If you're above that, you're having enough births to grow your population. You can see the US has really been below that for several decades. You can see some countries like Korea, Italy, Japan, those are those lines right on the bottom. If you study their economies and their demographics, they're actually a couple decades ahead of us because their birth rates have been so low and they're really struggling with that aging population. So again, the US, not an uncommon trend for developed countries. But one thing that is interesting is normally as we talk about birth rates and stuff, a lot of people go to immigration. They're like, okay, we need more legal immigration. We need to get more people in here who can work. But one point is these birth rates really are declining across the whole world. So increasingly as we move ahead, there will be more developed countries competing for that potential workforce from across the country. So it will be a more competitive market in that perspective as well as we charge ahead. All right, so lots of good news, right? All these HR people out here are like, not looking very happy. So I encourage people, though, as we're talking about this, the first step is, business, hiring. There's always going to be uncertainty. There's always going to be challenges. The first step is really just understanding what's going on and where we're headed, because then you can really make a good talent strategy for your company. None of this means your company can't be successful, but you've got to focus maybe on some different things than you have in the past. So just by understanding what's going on in the talent market and where we're headed, you've got a huge advantage to that employer or that business that doesn't quite understand what's happening in the market. So that's my encouragement to you. So I'll touch on briefly, again, only at 30 minutes, but I'll touch on briefly a couple of the things you really need to be thinking about. Overall, we would say you've got to think about how you value your most valuable asset, which is your people. And hopefully us in this room, we've always thought those are our most valuable asset. We've always valued them and treated them well. But now it won't become that's just a nice thing to do as a business. That will become an essential thing to do to be a sustainable company. So let's talk about a couple strategies you need to be thinking about as an employer with this in mind. So on the short-term side, one thing, we're 2 years in past the pandemic, 3 years really, so you've probably been looking at your wages, especially on that entry-level workforce. This is something we're encouraging companies. Historically, you had to look at those wages maybe once a year, maybe every 2 years. Now you really got to be looking at almost on a quarterly basis. We've seen those entry-level wages from January 2020 to today increase 25 to 35%. So you really got to be studying those wages and making sure you're staying ahead. We see companies that stay ahead of that. Not that you have to be at the 90 percentile, but if you're staying ahead of it, you're going to do much better than if you fall behind. If you fall behind, it's going to hurt you on the attraction side, hurt you on the retention side, and then you're going to be trying to catch up. So definitely look at your wages, make sure you're staying competitive. Second, open your doors wider for hires. And this can mean a lot of different things, but make sure you're looking at your hiring requirements. Are you requiring a high school diploma or a college degree if it's not really necessary to the work that's being done? That's one thing you could look at. Are you looking at other population groups like people with disabilities or maybe returning citizens, people who have some sort of criminal conviction? Those are some untapped or underutilized populations that you definitely could tap into as an employer. It also means maybe you're rethinking some of your scheduling and your flexibility. So we work with a lot of manufacturers, and manufacturers might have 3 different shifts, but they've got very set schedules. And if someone can't work for that set schedule, they can't work for you. They're not able to work for you. But if you're able to create a bigger variety of schedules or more flexibility, maybe you can tap into more demographics. Maybe you can tap into that person who has to take their kids to school or has to pick up their kids after the bus. Maybe you can tap into those people who need public transportation. Because if you look at public transportation, it's very limited and it might not work for most of your shifts if you're in a traditional manufacturing environment. So in a lot of our talks with employers, like, well, what's the best schedule we can do? And then I would say there isn't really a best schedule, but whatever you can do just to open it up to more people, that's going to help you have a wider group of the workforce that potentially could work for you. So just be thinking, how can you open your doors wider? Because that's really what we need to do, is you need to make it so that more people in that limited workforce are able to come and work for you. A couple other things is onboarding with excellence. As we talk about fighting retention, really one of the most important things for short-term and long-term retention is that onboarding experience. So onboarding isn't those first 4 hours with HR. It's really the first 90 days. It's the first 6 months. How are you really just enveloping that person into your culture and making sure they belong? So really focus on that onboarding. Doing that well can be one of your best retention strategies. And then training. It's one reason we launched our training company, Frontline Training Solutions, because we really do feel that training is so important for a couple reasons. One, because it's so important for retention, especially for those younger generations. They want to be invested in, they want to be developed. That's one of the top requests they have for a place where they want to work. And two, because as we mentioned before, you might not be able to hire someone that has 90% of the skills you need. You might be able to hire someone that has 50% of the skills you need and has that capacity to learn and has a good culture fit. So if you're going to get them from 50% to 100, you need to make sure you have the right structures and systems in place at your company to train and develop them where they need to go. All right, so those are a couple of short-term strategies. A couple of long-term strategies we spend a lot of time talking about. You've got to become an employer of choice, and becoming an employer of choice is so important. Really moving ahead as we look at that longer-term labor shortage. That's not something that's going to probably make a drastic change. So those employers that can become destination places to work are going to have a huge competitive advantage over their competition. So you really have to put as much emphasis into this strategy as you do into your sales and marketing strategy, as you do into your finance strategy. It's so important, more important than ever before. So how do you do that? First off, you really have to make that workforce planning an executive level conversation. So you got to make sure these sorts of conversations are happening at the C-suite. Some of the stats we shared today are great things that we're often talking to HR people and they're like, I'm going to share that with my CEO. That's a great thing to do because really you need that conversation happening at the senior level of an organization. Next is you got to create career paths. Career paths are so important. I'll highlight that for 2 reasons. One is you've got a lot of baby boomers who are probably retiring. So if you have a career path, you can help make sure you're backfilling as they leave. And two, career paths is so important for retention, especially on some of those younger generations. They want to know what's next. They want to know their pathway in your organization. If they have to guess or try and figure out what their pathway is in your organization, they might look for their pathway outside of your organization. So those career paths, very important. And then next, doing more with less. So we do a lot of talking with companies about resurfacing some lean manufacturing principles or lean office principles, or a lot of discussion about automation and technology. So be thinking about, this isn't about laying people off so you can save money. This is about, if I want to grow 30%, how can I grow 30% by only increasing my head count 10%? So as employers, we're going to need to move into an environment where you're really focusing on what do you do really well, what do we really specialize in, and then what do we maybe not want to spend our man hours on, because those man hours are very important. All right, a couple last things. One is building some really good partnership and talent pipelines. Maybe that's with companies like Express or Specialized Recruiting Group, but also things like building pipelines with universities, building pipelines with high schools. A lot of companies are doing innovative things with some pipelines from the prisons. So as people are re-entering society, they're going straight to employment. So what are those pipelines you can build to help fuel that talent pipeline? And then finally, I'm really passionate about marketing. I actually come from more of a marketing background. And I tell employers, you really got to tell that brand, that employer story and employer brand. You need to put the same emphasis that you put in your marketing strategy to sell your product into your HR promotion and your selling your value proposition to people looking for work. So have you invested in video and social media and other assets to really brand your company as a great place to work? That's more important than ever. All right, so that's a couple of my thoughts on what's happening in the market, where are we headed, and how employers need to respond. So now I think I was asked just to share a little bit about how I integrate my faith into my work, a little bit about my testimony. So I'll touch on that a little bit, share a little bit about my story, and then I know after that we'll have a little bit of time for questions. So if you guys have questions, happy to dive into some of those. So I'll tell you just a little bit about myself. So actually I grew up in Orlando, Florida. So I grew up in Florida through high school, and then as mentioned earlier, I went to Calvin University. So moved up here, went to Calvin University. As I was growing up, my parents owned a business. I worked in that business from a young age. I actually started some of my own businesses online in high school. Always was very passionate about business. I just love business. I like marketing. I like some of the numbers and finance and analytical side, as you guys have probably seen me talking about all the numbers. So I always really loved that. I was one of those few business majors at school where I was like, I'm doing a business major because I actually really like business. It wasn't because I thought I would make the most money or because I didn't know what else I should pick and my parents said that would be a good career choice. I actually really was passionate about business. So always been passionate about that. So went to Calvin, and then when I graduated, I actually worked at a digital marketing agency for several years. So I started there during a really good time of growth. I actually started as an analyst. After a year, I was actually leading a team of analysts and was on the senior management team as a director of data analysis. So really great opportunity for me as a very young leader to get some leadership experience and a company leading experience as well. So I did that for a good bit, but then I really was kind of looking at what do I want to do next. As I love business, I'm passionate about business, but I really wanted my work to connect to my faith much more closely. Obviously, at the company I was at, it was a great place to work. We were giving people good jobs, we were helping employers, but that connection was maybe not as apparent as I wanted it to be. So I started talking to Janice, who many of you know Janice Petrini, the founder of Express and my co-owner now. She's actually also my mother-in-law, so that's kind of how I knew Janice. Known her for quite a while. Family gatherings, we would always be talking about business stuff, and the rest of our family would be rolling their eyes at us as we're talking about marketing and business. So started talking to her and decided to make that transition from leadership role at a kind of growing technology advertising company to come and join her with that potential long-term to be a co-owner with her. And that really was probably the best decision I've ever made. So in our work, it's so purposeful, the work we do, and I can be passionate about business and marketing and all the things I love to do, but at the end of the day, every single interaction we have with someone, we're helping them find a job, helping them find that purpose and meaning, or we're helping a company be sustainable and helping them be a better place to work. So every day the work we're doing is so purposeful. And now at that ownership level, we really think about just how can we care for those people in our charge. So we really feel that as employers, as Christian business leaders, it's really our responsibility to care for those in our charge, be an example of Christ. It doesn't mean that you're, out there witnessing to every employee, but you're witnessing through your example and how you're living your life and how you're leading your business. So that's something we're very passionate about. We just redefined our overall vision across all three companies now, and that is to help people discover their purpose and achieve their potential. And that really goes across our businesses, whether we're helping a job seeker find that job, or whether we're working with our internal employees to help them really achieve their full potential. Because at the end of the day, we believe that that's really what God wants, right? He wants us to lean into our strengths and to glorify Him by using them to their fullest. So that's kind of what we're passionate about, what I'm passionate about, and how we really integrate that faith into the work we do every day. So that's all I've got for you.
So what questions do you have for David?
David,
Yeah.
how do you see the leader's mindset being a challenge, in terms of, hey, I had to earn to get to the management level. You talk about very quickly rising in the ranks.
Yeah, that's a great question. On our training side, we do a lot of training with leaders. Really, that's our core area as leaders, and that's really that challenge you have to overcome with leaders, especially a lot of maybe those frontline leaders, especially maybe like manufacturing or some of those settings where you do have that leader who's been there for 30 years and now they're supervised and they're like, well, back when I was started, I was just happy to get a paycheck and you should be happy that you're working here. So really, we spend a good bit of time actually educating leaders on what's really happening in the market, because what we see is most mid to maybe frontline leaders, they don't actually know what's going on in the market. They think there might still be a whole lineup of people out there waiting to get a job, but really there's not. So you have to shift that dynamic with leaders. And I think, you really have to change that mindset from I think what you shared is that's that mindset of you're a manager, but you're not really a leader. You're not really taking care of those in your charge. So it's working with them to help shift that mindset, really focus on servant leadership. We even had some companies we worked with, they were struggling with retention, and we worked with them to help create a solution where they actually were one of the key measurement performances for each frontline leader was their retention rate for their current employees. And when they started getting measured on their retention, it really shifted their mindset because they were being held accountable for that. So then instead of them being, I'm going to have a bad attitude about this millennial or this even younger than millennial, they shifted to how can I coach this person and help this person and make sure that they're going to retain. So it's really, like you said, it is shifting that mindset. It does take some work, but that's where you've got to start.
A few more minutes. What are the questions?
Right, over here.
During COVID, we heard a lot about folks leaving the workforce to start their own businesses. And I didn't see any of that in your statistics, so I'm wondering, is that apocryphal or is that something that is real?
Yeah, that definitely, as we look at that drop in that labor force participation rate, some of those people might be capturing that, a lot of them probably aren't. So it definitely is a factor in that dropping labor force participation rate. A lot of people are starting their own business. A lot of people are, a lot of moms and parents left the workforce because they had to care for their kids, but now they're selling stuff on Etsy, or they're driving Uber, or they're doing Shipt. So definitely some of that gig economy or that starting businesses is definitely in the flux too. So as employers, you're really not just competing against other employers like the past, but all these other sorts of things where people can make ends meet too. Mm-hmm. Yeah, in the back?
What do you think creates a good servant leader or a great leader?
Oh, good question. All right, do I have another 30 minutes to answer that one? So I think, for me and for us in this room with that, foundation of faith, I think we really can look at a lot of how Christ led and just think about, servant leadership, it's almost in the name, right? So you're serving others as you grow in responsibility at our company, as you grow in responsibility, you're not doing less and pushing it on others, you're doing more, and you're just more empowered to really help care for everyone and do what's best for them. So, yeah.
What types of benefit programs are you seeing companies and industries doing today to help retain and attract talent?
Yeah, good question. companies are really taking a deeper look at benefits as they have over the last couple of years. Wages are really important, but benefits is also very important. So a lot of employers are coming to the table with covering more premiums on the health insurance and all those traditional benefits. Some larger employers, Gentex is actually a really good example of this. Not everyone can do this, but they're being very innovative and helping provide childcare for their workforce because they knew they have to employ thousands of people. How can they do that? We could remove that childcare barrier. So some larger companies, obviously most companies don't have the capacity to do that, but some companies are starting to maybe reimburse for childcare. I would say the biggest shift we've seen, it's not maybe a benefit, but it's along the same realm there, is that just increased flexibility and creativity with people. So instead of employers being very rigid on this is exactly what I need, they're going to talk to someone and say, well, what do you need to work here? Okay, you need to just work Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. All right, we can find a spot for you here. It's better to have someone those 3 days than to not have someone at all. So really it's, I would say, being creative and maybe rethinking it a little bit where you're tailoring it for each individual on that approach as opposed to maybe a blanket approach.
Thank you, David. Let's give him
Yep.
a big round.